Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating dialogue from our source text, one that uses an incredibly advanced alien observer to neutrally evaluate the Israeli Palestinian conflict. It's just incredibly hard to look at long-standing geopolitical conflicts without bringing all of our own emotions, historical biases, and deep-seated loyalties into the mix. We all do it. But the source material we're looking at today introduces a completely different philosophical framework. It asks us to look at the Middle East not through the tired eyes of a historian or a politician, but through the totally detached, highly logical eyes of an extraterrestrial visitor. What would they actually see? What would they recommend? It's a gripping thought experiment, and as you'll see, it evolves dramatically from a naive optimism in 1998 all the way to a very sobering reflection in 2026. Here's our roadmap for this review. We'll be moving through 5 stages: the alien's perspective, the 1998 neighborhood model, the shattered illusion in 2026, oppressive regime versus citizens, and finally, preserving human dignity. Starting with Section 1, the alien's perspective, stripping away emotional baggage. So, to kick things off, the authors introduced this brilliant framework, viewing the region strictly through the emotionless, objective eyes of an alien visitor. By using this detached perspective, the text proposes that we can finally bypass those heavy historical memories that usually trap both sides in an endless loop. Imagine an advanced alien just lands on Earth. They have absolutely no idea about the complex history of the region. They don't have religious affiliations, they carry zero generational trauma. Literally all they see is a piece of land, half of which is unsettled, with 2 groups of people living on it. This alien lens is a philosophical tool, and it forces us to look strictly at present realities and shared futures, stripping away all those blinding layers of the past. The authors basically use this lens to ask one fundamental question: how should these 2 groups view each other to achieve a respectful, unthreatened coexistence?
Moving to Section 2, the 1998 neighborhood model, finding a way to live together.
Let's rewind to 1998. The text outlines the alien's initial, highly logical thesis. The authors argue the alien would look at the situation and evaluate 3 sequential approaches for how the populations should view one another. Are they relatives? Are they former enemies? Or are they simply neighbors? The alien meticulously weighs each of these societal metaphors to figure out which one could practically work on the ground. Well, the alien completely rejects the first 2 options, right out of the gate. The source text points out that the relatives metaphor carries way too much unhealthy baggage from the Abrahamic stories. From the Jewish perspective presented in the text, there's this sense of being the lords of the land promised to Isaac, viewing Ishmael as the son of a maidservant. Meanwhile, the Palestinian perspective holds this deep, humiliating memory of Hagar and Ishmael being unjustly expelled. The authors note this just creates a toxic, unworkable dynamic of superiority and humiliation. So, the alien then looks at the former enemies model, and it rejects that one too. Why? Because it traps everyone in a destructive winner-loser dynamic. The source notes that the losing side often falsely relies on outside Arab states to eventually swoop in and rescue them. But the text observes that those surrounding nations have massive domestic crises of their own. We're talking staggering population growth, huge economic struggles. And rather than solving the issue, they actually use the Palestinian plight as a tool to gain international sympathy and funding. Instead, the text proposes the neighbors model. The alien is just totally baffled that people are fighting over dirt instead of solving critical, shared regional threats. What's really striking about the alien's observation here is how incredibly mundane, yet absolutely vital these shared problems are. Looking down from orbit, it sees social issues like drug crime and joblessness, it sees massive health and environmental threats like polluted groundwater and hazardous waste, and it sees failing infrastructure, water shortages, paralyzing traffic jams. According to the alien's logic, these issues do not care about borders. They don't care about ideology, they threaten everyone equally. So, the crucial takeaway of this 1998 thesis is this very civic-minded metaphor: focus on shared duties to build a respectful, unthreatened environment. The authors frame this as simple civic engineering. Look, you don't have to love your neighbors, you don't even get to choose them. But if you want to live in a clean, functional building, everybody has to chip in. You clean the building together, and you tend to the shared garden. It's a straightforward, highly optimistic vision of coexistence, entirely based on mutual self-interest. Which brings us to Section 3, the shattered illusion in 2026, the return of the alien. Fast forward to the aftermath of October 2023. Let's trace how this timeline builds, violently shattering the illusion of that shared garden when faced with the brutal reality of ideological violence. We start with that naive civic optimism of 1998. But then, bam, the timeline hits 2023. This represents a violent rejection of coexistence, which forces the authors into a space of incredibly sober moral reflection by 2026. The text asks a heavy question. What happens when the alien returns 28 years later and sees that the neighbor doesn't want to tend the garden, but instead wants to burn the entire building down?
The authors point out that the neighborhood model collapses entirely, just completely falls apart, when one side educates its children to view the total destruction of the other as a legitimate ideal. The source text vividly describes the shock of the October 2023 events, pointing to the deep, institutionalized brainwashing that has fostered this visceral hatred. The authors specifically reference some chilling anecdotes from the conflict. For instance, a phone call where a son proudly boasted to his parents about murdering civilians with his bare hands, and his mother actually celebrated it. For the authors, this represents an ideology focused entirely on the total erasure of a state. It forces a painful realization. Maybe that 1998 alien was just way too naive. You cannot simply apply a civic neighborhood solution to an ideology that explicitly glorifies death.
Now for Section 4, Oppressive Regime versus Citizens, a broader geopolitical shadow. As the alien observes the wider region in 2026, the text shifts focus to the overarching shadow of the Iranian regime. This brilliantly illustrates the author's most vital geopolitical distinction. They contrast a leadership that uses external hatred to survive internally against a captive public that is absolutely desperate for change. The source text draws a stark contrast here. On one hand, you have a regime in Tehran. The authors explicitly compare them to Haman, the biblical figure who sought the destruction of the Jewish people in ancient Persia. This modern regime hangs dissidents, shoots at its own protesting citizens, and pours massive resources into funding proxy groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis just to encircle Israel with ballistic missiles. But, on the other hand, the alien hears the voices of the Iranian citizens themselves, regular people risking their lives to protest and calling for freedom. Faced with these extreme dynamics, the authors use the alien to pose this pivotal, dramatic question to you, the viewer. Who is the real enemy of whom? Is the Iranian public, a people with whom Israel shares absolutely no borders, no historical wars, and no land disputes, are they the enemy? Or is the true enemy a regime that is so terrified of its own people that it has to manufacture an external war just to justify its iron-fisted rule at home? The text argues quite powerfully that a regime willing to slaughter its own people to maintain power is the enemy of life itself. And that brings us to our final section, Preserving Human Dignity. The moral climax. This is the true synthesis of the author's argument. How do you hold on to your morality while fighting for your literal survival? They emphasize that just as the free world defeated Nazi Germany by crushing a regime rather than annihilating the German people, a righteous fight absolutely must maintain its moral boundary. The source text pushes back hard against the temptation to just give in to absolute despair or generalized hatred. It argues that if you adopt the logic of annihilation that your enemy uses, well, you lose the moral high ground that justified your existence in the first place. You have to decisively defeat an ideology that glorifies death, yes, but you absolutely cannot adopt its language of total destruction. The ultimate conclusion here is that true strength requires the strict discipline of fighting a dangerous system without developing a generalized hatred for its citizens. The authors point out that refusing to develop hatred, that isn't a sign of weakness. Actually, it is a sign of immense moral discipline. It's the crucial ability to differentiate between a temporary, deeply dangerous ideological enemy and a future population of people with whom you might one day share this planet peacefully. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought from the authors. Can we fiercely defend our existence today while still keeping our humanity intact enough to reach out to our neighbors tomorrow? The alien's final lesson isn't just about how to survive a conflict, it's about what happens next. When the dust finally settles and the dangerous ideologies fall, we are still going to be human beings sharing the exact same space. How we fight today entirely determines who we will be on that day after victory. Thank you so much for joining me on this thought-provoking explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you on the next one.